Welcome back to Mzansi Welcomes the World. Now, we're going to be continuing the discussion on inequality. And as the world's economies converges in Nasdaq, Johannesburg, in just over 9 days' time, the question is, can or will inequality be addressed, or will there be a supposed roadmap for that to happen? Do remember, this summit does not have any legally binding consequences, but what it should do is take the recommendations and take them in a serious light. From the latest global inequality report to the campaign Oxfam has launched on taxing the super rich, these are going to be the discussions as to whether global inequality will be targeted or addressed at the summit. Joining me now, I'd like to welcome Matshidiso Lencoasa, who is from the Budget Justice Coalition. Matshidiso, absolute pleasure having you on. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, good afternoon, or good evening rather. Thank you for the opportunity.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. Matshidiso, I just had a very intense interview with the former Statistician General, Dr. Padi Lehotla, and he's of the opinion that there's a sort of question mark that's going to be hung over in terms of dealing with the inequality question. From the Budget Justice Coalition point of view, can this be achieved within South Africa's G20 presidency?
Yeah, so I think it's a very important question you ask because, as you know, South Africa is one of the most unequal societies in the world, most unequal economies in the world. And, you know, at the same time, we are privileged to be hosting the whole nation, the whole world in our nation at this point. So it is an opportune moment to really talk about inequality, because inequality impacts many nations across the world, but it is so much more prevalent in a context like ours, developing context like ours, notably in South Africa. And to really answer whether the G20 is capable, the summit on its own is capable of eradicating or pushing us further in addressing the inequality question. I mean, ideally it should be. I mean, if we have these kind of summits where world leaders come together to solve problems, they should be, you know, priority should be the most pressing and urgent problems that the world is facing, especially with the G20. G20's economic policy all the way. What is our economy doing, our global economy doing to better the lives of people across the world? Unfortunately, I'm a little bit hesitant to believe that that will actually happen, because much of the inequality, the actual structure, the nature of the G20 versus other developing countries, for instance, it leaves much to be desired. And I think that even those kind of processes, the international financial architecture, international financial institutions, are actually entrenching the inequality that we're trying to address. So even though hopeful that there's the report that the president has launched as well, which we welcome, but I also am quite skeptical about the efficacy of these summits, especially also because we're ordinary South Africans participating in G20 processes throughout the year. Definitely not many people actually don't even know about the G20, which already tells me what we need to know about how effective they will be at solving ordinary people's problems.
Playing on our screen right now, Matshidiso, was that handing over of the Global Inequality Report. And it just shows the widening between the rich and the poor, especially from a post-pandemic perspective. What was your initial reaction to that? And will the G20, because this is within the G20 context, will there be the willingness to actually take that report and have actionable, tangible, desirable aspects to it?
So initial reaction to it, I think any opportunity to talk about inequality is so crucial. And so it was great to hear that there was a report that, you know, to just see it and to see it as a priority area for South Africa's G20 presidency. I mean, if there's anything that we should be talking about, it's inequality. And, you know, so on the one hand, that's that's the welcomed aspects of it, or what we were looking forward to. But unfortunately, when you actually look at the politics of the G20 and the machinations also of the G20, you think, well, like you mentioned, it's not legally binding, right? So it relies on political will, and it relies on buy-in by member states. And when I look at it from the outside, my opinion is that the greatest buy-in happens to be from South Africa and the African Union. But then if you actually look at domestic policies, they don't actually reflect that sort of buy-in. South Africa, I mean, yesterday we had the medium-term budget policy statement, so the mini budget speech, and it was appeasing international markets and appeasing that kind of thing. And then also we're seeing campaigns to clean up Johannesburg. I mean, we've been, as people who live in Johannesburg, we've been long calling for such interventions, especially people who live in the most marginalized communities have been calling for such interventions. But it is when the international community comes that they make pressing urgency, which makes us think, are our domestic policies actually serving international markets? If that's the case, then how can we be assured that when we're on an international scale, we will be represented in the way that we need to be, if on a domestic level we're not? And so I think there's an issue, I think, or concern that because it's not legally binding, these G20 processes, it relies on political will and what's politically favorable at that moment. We have the issue of, firstly, it might look good politically to participate or to advocate for inequality, to overcoming inequality, but what more, who's to compel them to do anything with that report? And then secondly, I think we also see the lack of political will. We see the lack of participation, for instance, by America, and the denouncing of the theme that we have, which includes equality and building an equitable world. America, who's going to be the G20 president, who's taking it forward next year, might just decide to scrap it completely. What I'm trying to say is that it really relies on member states' political will and interest in these issues, and these issues haven't really seen those member states prioritizing them. So I'm concerned that it might just be a little more than lip service.
Matshidiso, before we go to the break, and you mentioned the United States of America, and I think it's an interesting discussion to have with regards to this, because when you look at the rhetoric coming out of the White House, it completely is different to what would want to be discussed at this G20 Leaders Summit in terms of discussing the inequality. And I want to bring it to the Global South, because it's the Global South that is bearing the brunt of this actual inequality. So when whatever is being discussed in the next 9 days gets carried through to Washington, it may just be a piece of paper that gets thrown away and we're back to square one.
Exactly, and I think that's one of our biggest concerns with that is, like I said, this G20 summit, these are processes that are opportunities maybe to talk about things, to reflect and to reconsider things like our international financial architecture, our institutions, the role of the IMF or the World Bank and how ordinary people, we see that in South Africa, are bearing the burden of that in South Africa and in Africa at large, in developing countries, But then when you actually look at, in principle, like what can be done, I think that it ends up being, this fancy summit where people, and I attended last year actually in Brazil, and I mean, Brazil did such a great job. Like some of the recommendations that they had put forward in the G20 processes were just really brilliant. But as to whether they can be applied on a day-to-day, I mean, if you spoke to the people, the ordinary people there on a day-to-day or how they're experiencing things, it seemed that the international, what they're presenting to the global markets versus how ordinary people experience the domestic policy, it's consistent to how South Africans have been experiencing and talking about the G20. So it would be great to see it being more than just rhetoric and an opportunity for incredibly wealthy world leaders coming together and talking about, talking about these issues. But the way that it's rolled out also, I mean, the communities that we've been engaging with as the BJC, they keep asking, like, we hear that there's a G20. I mean, we were in Marikana the other day, and they were saying, we're hearing that there's a G20 process, but we're not a part of it. Why is that the case? And I think that therein lies the problem.
After the break, I'll continue my conversation with Matshidiso Lencoasa. And I want to stick on that point that Matshidiso ended off. Here domestically in South Africa, is there a will to include the people in the decision making, especially vulnerable communities that till now do not have the same economic participation as the rest of the country? My conversation continues after the break. Welcome back to Mzansi Welcomes the World. I'm still in conversation with Matshidiso Lencoasa from the Budget Justice Coalition. Matshidiso, I want to continue from where we left off on South Africa and this understanding or inclusion within the G20 conversation, because it's important that we first sweep our own front door before going outside of it. Have we swept our front door, especially from an economics perspective?
Yeah, from an economics perspective, I think you're right. Yesterday, like I mentioned before the break, is that we had the mini budget speech, so the adjustments budget speech, and it was really, the rhetoric was around appeasing international markets, which, you know, has its merit potentially, but one of the questions that we had is, where are the people in this budget speech? And I think that extends to the conversations around the global economy. What's the point of all these economic processes and the economy at large if it's not to better the lives of ordinary people? And I think that, you know, you do mention that we need to walk the talk. We don't just need to be going on international platforms and saying, we need this as a global economy, we need this for our people, but then in our own backyard, we're not able to do that, or not even trying hard enough to do so. And we try hard when the world leaders come to arrive on our doorstep. Then we start to try hard, and I think that is that's where the problem lies. And I think that yes, the G20 could have been an opportunity to do that. We could have started from scratch last year. I mean, this was also through the GNU process last year, which was something that was, you know, a new opportunity in the country, or it was framed in that way. But unfortunately, it just seems much of the same old, same old. It is unfortunate because it just seems that, oh, we had all these processes, and yes, maybe we might have a beautiful inequality report, but what is the point of it all if we can't lead by example as a country? And yeah, I think that's what we're most concerned about.
Matshidiso, I want to get your take on this. Yesterday, I had Isabel Fryer from Oxfam South Africa. Similar question I asked Dr. Lehotla about this tax the super rich campaign. And I had two different spectrums of it yesterday. I had the Free Market Foundation and I had Oxfam just having this discussion. And I guess you're familiar with the tax the super rich campaign. But again, just a reminder to the audience that it's a campaign which Oxfam launched to try and see if the wealthy of the world, the billionaires and the trillionaires, can be taxed 1 to 2% of their wealth to address inequality. Is that a feasible sort of project, Matshidiso, to address inequality in this world?
Sure. Well, I think that any intervention that is foregrounded in reducing inequalities and redressing the harms that are currently faced in our country needs to be considered. I think that we're at a point where the most marginalized people, ordinary people in this country, on the continent, in developing context, just marginalized people around the world are bearing the burden of an economy that's not working, that's failing, and it is just so extractive. You know, it's just such an extractive economy that we have as in the world, really, not just in our country. And I think that this, like, thinking about interventions or how we use our budgets or how we use our fiscal policy, economic policy to solve that problem is something that must be welcomed. I think that for instance, like Oxfam forms part of the Budget Justice Coalition. So that's definitely something that we support, interventions to ensure that wealthy people actually pay their fair share. I think other ways that we as the BJC have been advocating for wealthy people, people to pay their taxes, is that we've seen that there's a huge problem in our country of illicit financial flows, and not just in our country, across the world, where the super wealthy are not paying their fair share of taxes, and the ordinary South African and the ordinary citizen and the ordinary person in the world is forced to pay effectively their share of taxes. So incredibly rich people are able to scapegoat their way through tax evasion, through illicit financial flows. And those are interventions that, things like the G20, we're really hoping that there will be mechanisms that they introduce that can tighten that to prevent that sort of thing from happening. So if there's anything that people who follow the G20 process need to do in terms of holding the member states accountable, it would definitely be to reform the tax infrastructure in our country, in the world, to ensure that every single person is paying their fair share. It's not fair that incredibly wealthy people are able to wiggle their way out while the rest of us are forced to pay taxes, and we're not even getting our fair share, or we're not seeing the return on that. And so that is something that's worth exploring, definitely.
Matshidiso, I want you to get your counter to this, because it's a question that, or an answer that the Free Market Foundation had given me on the show yesterday, when they mentioned that a free market would allow for minimal state intervention in open markets as a part of prosperity. How does the Budget Justice Coalition respond to that argument, particularly looking at inequality?
Yeah, so I think, unfortunately, I mean, it's good, and I really appreciate that there's a balanced or diverse views that are shared, because it's really important to have these kind of discussions so that we can agitate towards an economy and interventions that actually do serve, put ordinary people at the heart of it. And I think a question like this is also important in doing so, and to really share the BJC's perspective. I mean, we are always trying to hold the states accountable for a budget that works, and this is foregrounded in the Constitution, because the Constitution, one of the constitutional obligations is to build a capable state. It is the Constitution that talks about a state that's capable, and so that's why that's our side of struggle, is making sure that our state actually does, because the state actually has a constitutional obligation. Whereas I worry when it comes to the markets is that ideally, it might sound great that, a competition is a battle of the best, and then, people win. That's how it should be. But unfortunately, there's no regulation or intervention that is proposed that could prevent the markets from abusing their power to ordinary people. I mean, already we have state intervention, and we still have markets that are disproportionately benefiting, huge players that are disproportionately benefiting at the expense of SMMEs, at the expense of ordinary people in the country and in the world. And there's no constitutional obligation of the market to ensure that we can eradicate inequality, or constitutional obligation to ensure that children are well fed, that people have access to quality basic education and healthcare services. And so those are some of the worries that I would imagine that we have as the Budget Justice Coalition. And I think we also just believe in the beauty and, the beauty of our dreams of building this economy that works, and coming together and pooling our resources as people. I think when we talk to people, it doesn't seem that paying taxes inherently is the problem. I think the problem is that we're paying these taxes, but the quality of public services that we're getting in return on is not up to scratch, and that's what we need to be dealing with. And I think that that's the leverage point that we should be addressing, not so much the entire process of paying taxes, for instance, or state intervention, because ideally, this is foregrounded with this view that we're all coming together to build something that works. And I do see a role for the state in achieving this.
Matshidiso, you mentioned the beauty of having an economy that works for everyone, that could also be termed as a just economy. What is a just economy in the eyes of the Budget Justice Coalition? And will this G20 Leaders Summit have the discussions of a just economy in addressing the inequality that we have in our world right now?
Yeah. So for us as the Budget Justice Coalition, our view of a just economy is an economy that puts people at the heart of it. So we are definitely tired of hearing the same old when it comes to taxes, when it comes to debt, when it comes to tariffs, rebates, all of that terminology, and wondering, what does that mean for ordinary people? What does it mean for bettering the lives of ordinary people? And so that's what we are agitating towards, an economy that isn't just an economy where the ultra rich or the very few people can benefit from it, but it is an opportunity to actually secure the futures of people in our country and people in the world. And so those are the things that we're looking forward to. But in terms of whether this G20 process will achieve that, I think that it does depend on, firstly, it does depend on the outcomes. And I think the question that you had asked me specifically, which I think is interesting, is will we be having those discussions? And, you know, South Africa, we're really good at talking. Even our government, like, we're very good at having discussions. Unfortunately, I think we're at a point where we would like more than just lip service as a country. We would like more than just acknowledgement of inequality, of poverty, of unemployment, for example. We actually would like the tools, the economic policies and the tools that we have at our disposal to be actually wielded towards solving the triple challenge that we see that we're facing in this country. And you know, the G20 will come and go, but it's ultimately up to our leaders to take it very seriously, to actually lead by example and show the rest of the world how serious we are about addressing inequality.
Walk the talk, and a question mark after that. Matshidiso Lencoasa, absolute pleasure having you on. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
That's Matshidiso Lencoasa from the Budget Justice Coalition. That's all we have for you here on Mzansi Welcomes the World. I will see you again on Saturday afternoon. If you have missed today's episode, be sure to find it on our YouTube channel. From myself, Hospital, the rest of the team in Johannesburg, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.